Can one African king stand against a powerful European empire and win? This is the story of Menelik II, the Ethiopian emperor who united a divided nation and led his people to one of the greatest victories in African history. At a time when much of Africa was being claimed by European powers, he proved that freedom could still be defended by a leader with vision, patience, and courage. But this is more than the story of a famous battle. It is the story of a boy who lost his freedom, a prince who learned patience in captivity, and a ruler who understood that the greatest victories are prepared long before they are ever fought. Welcome to the African Archive, where we bring African history to life through the people who shaped it. If you enjoy thoughtful, well-researched documentaries like this, please subscribe and join us as we uncover the stories that changed our continent and the world. Before he became the emperor who stunned Europe, before his name echoed across Africa, before the victory at Adwa inspired generations to dream of freedom, he was simply a young prince named Solomon. And his journey began not on a throne, but behind the walls of a prison fortress. Chapter 1. The Prince in Captivity. Long before history remembered him as Emperor Menelik II, he was a young prince named Solomon. He was born on August 17, 1844, in the Kingdom of Shoa, a powerful region in the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopia was one of the world's oldest kingdoms, with a proud history, deep Christian traditions, and a people determined to protect their independence. But beneath that proud history lay a difficult truth. The country was divided. Powerful regional rulers often competed for influence, and these rivalries made Ethiopia vulnerable. It was into this uncertain world that Solomon was born. His father, Menelik II, was the king of Shoa. From him, the young prince learned that leadership required courage. After the death of his mother, Wazero Ejigea, while he was still a child, he was raised by relatives and trusted advisors who ensured he received the education expected of a future ruler. He studied Ethiopia's history and the teachings of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He learned that wisdom, justice, and humility were just as important as strength. But life had other plans. In the 1850s, Emperor Tewodros II set out to unite Ethiopia under one ruler. He believed the country's divisions had made it weak and that only a strong central government could protect it. When King Menelik II resisted, war became unavoidable. The armies of Shoa were defeated. Menelik II died, and the young prince was taken captive. In a single moment, Solomon lost his father, his kingdom, and his freedom. He was taken to the mountain fortress of Magdala, where Emperor Tewodros kept him under close watch. For many young boys, captivity would have meant the end of hope. For Solomon, it became the beginning of an education that no school could offer. Every day, he watched the emperor govern. He listened as nobles debated important decisions. He saw how alliances were made and how quickly they could fall apart. Most of all, he learned patience. He understood that acting too soon could cost him everything. So instead of fighting with anger, he waited for the right opportunity. Years passed. Then, in 1865, that opportunity finally came. With the help of loyal supporters, Solomon escaped from Magdala under the cover of darkness. It was a dangerous journey, but he made his way back to Shoa, where his people welcomed him with joy. The prince they thought they had lost had returned home. Soon afterward, he was crowned king of Shoa. But the young king who took the throne was not the same boy who had been captured years earlier. Captivity had changed him. He had learned that true leadership was not about power alone. It was about patience, preparation, and knowing when to act. Those lessons would guide every decision he made for the rest of his life. One day, they would help him defend not just a kingdom, but an entire nation. And when the greatest challenge in Ethiopia's history finally arrived, the former prisoner from Magdala would be ready. Chapter 2. The Rise of the King. Returning to Shoa was only the beginning. Solomon had escaped captivity, but now he faced an even greater challenge. He had to rebuild a kingdom. Years of conflict had left Shoa weakened. Some local rulers questioned whether the young prince was ready to lead. Others watched carefully, waiting to see if he would succeed or fail. Sola understood that earning a crown was one thing. Earning the people's trust was another. Instead of rushing into endless wars, he focused on strengthening his kingdom. He met with local chiefs, settled disputes, and built alliances with neighboring rulers. Wherever possible, he chose negotiation before conflict. It was a lesson he had learned during his years in captivity. A wise leader does not create enemies without reason. As Shoa became more stable, its people began to prosper. Farmers returned to their fields. Traders brought goods from distant regions. And confidence slowly returned to the kingdom. During this period, one remarkable woman entered his life. Her name was Tetu. Tetu was intelligent, fearless, and deeply devoted to Ethiopia. She understood politics as well as many of the men who surrounded the king. And she was never afraid to speak her mind. Their marriage became one of the most important partnerships in Ethiopian history. She was not simply a queen standing beside the throne. She was a trusted advisor. When difficult decisions had to be made, Menelik often listened to her counsel. Together, they shared a vision of an Ethiopia that was united, respected, and independent. As the years passed, Sola Meryam's influence spread beyond Shoa. More and more regional leaders recognized his wisdom and leadership. They saw a ruler who knew when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to wait. These qualities earned him both respect and loyalty. But while Shoa was growing stronger, the world beyond Ethiopia was changing rapidly. Across Europe, powerful nations were competing for wealth, resources, and territory. Their eyes were turning toward Africa. One by one, African kingdoms were falling under colonial rule. Sola Meryam watched these events carefully. He asked an important question. If European powers were taking control of so much of Africa, how long would it be before they came for Ethiopia? That question shaped the way he governed. He believed that a nation could not wait for danger before preparing for it. It had to become strong while there was still time. So he strengthened his administration. He encouraged trade with neighboring regions. He worked to bring more of Ethiopia's leaders together, knowing that a divided country would never be able to defend itself. Without realizing it, the young king was preparing for a challenge greater than any he had ever faced. History was about to place the fate of an ancient nation in his hands. Soon, the king of Shoa would become the emperor of Ethiopia. Chapter 3. The making of an emperor. In 1889, Ethiopia stood at another turning point. Its ruler, Emperor Yohannes IV, had been killed in battle while defending his country against invading forces from the north. Once again, the question echoed across the land. Who would lead Ethiopia? Many believed the answer was already clear. For years, Sola Meryam had transformed Shoa into one of the strongest and most stable kingdoms in the country. He had earned a reputation as a patient leader, a skilled diplomat, and a man who thought carefully before making difficult decisions. Now, that same man was called to lead an entire nation. In 1889, Sola Meryam was crowned Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia. It was the highest honor any Ethiopian ruler could receive. But Menelik understood that wearing the crown was only the beginning. He had inherited an ancient kingdom, but he wanted to prepare it for a new age. He believed Ethiopia could respect its traditions while embracing useful ideas from the modern world. One of his first great achievements was establishing Addis Ababa as Ethiopia's permanent capital. The city grew from a settlement that Menelik and Empress Tetu had chosen because of its favorable climate and natural hot springs. Over time, it became the political and economic heart of the nation. Today, it remains the capital of Ethiopia and the headquarters of the African Union. Menelik wanted his people to be connected. He encouraged the construction of new roads that linked distant parts of the country. He supported the expansion of trade, allowing merchants to travel more easily between regions. He introduced new technologies, including telegraph and telephone lines, so information could move faster than ever before. These changes may seem ordinary today. But in the late 19th century, they were signs of a country preparing for the future. Menelik also believed that knowledge was a source of strength. He welcomed diplomats, engineers, and skilled workers from different parts of the world. He observed how other nations were developing and adopted ideas that could benefit Ethiopia, while remaining determined to protect his country's independence. But there was one lesson he never forgot. Peace is strongest when a nation is ready to defend it. So, quietly and patiently, Menelik began strengthening Ethiopia's army. He purchased modern rifles and artillery from Europe. He improved the training of his soldiers. He encouraged regional leaders to work together rather than compete against one another. Some questioned why the emperor spent so much time preparing for a war that had not yet begun. Menelik had learned the value of preparation years earlier, as a young prisoner in Magdala. He knew that by the time danger arrived, it was often too late to begin preparing. As Ethiopia grew stronger, another force was growing stronger as well. Across Europe, powerful nations were dividing Africa among themselves in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Country after country lost its independence. Only a handful remained free. Menelik watched these events with growing concern. He hoped that diplomacy would protect Ethiopia. But he also understood that hope alone could never defend a nation. Soon, a treaty signed in friendship would bring Ethiopia face to face with a European empire. And the future of Africa would hang in the balance. Chapter 4. The Road to War. By the early 1890s, the map of Africa was changing at an alarming pace. Across the continent, European powers were claiming territory as if Africa belonged to them. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy were expanding their empires, each determined to control as much land as possible. Historians call this period the Scramble for Africa. For many African kingdoms, it was a time of fear and uncertainty. For Menelik II, it was a warning. He knew Ethiopia could not isolate itself from the rest of the world. His country would have to rely on wisdom, diplomacy, and, if necessary, the courage to fight. At first, Menelik believed that diplomacy could prevent war. In 1889, Ethiopia and Italy signed the Treaty of Warsaw. The agreement was meant to establish friendship between the two nations. But hidden inside the treaty was a dangerous deception. The treaty had been written in both Amharic and Italian. One sentence carried two completely different meanings. The Amharic version said that Ethiopia could ask Italy to represent it in foreign affairs if it chose to do so. The Italian version said that Ethiopia must conduct all its foreign relations through Italy. That single change transformed the Treaty of Friendship into a claim of control. Soon afterward, Italy announced to other European nations that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate. In other words, Italy claimed that Ethiopia was no longer fully independent. When Menelik learned what had happened, he was outraged. He had not signed away his country's freedom. He immediately rejected Italy's interpretation of the treaty and informed foreign governments that Ethiopia remained a sovereign nation. His message was clear. Ethiopia would decide its own future, not Italy. For several years, both sides tried to avoid war. Letters were exchanged. Diplomats held meetings. But neither side was willing to give up its position. Italy believed that Ethiopia would eventually surrender under pressure. Menelik knew that surrender would only invite more demands. Peace was slipping away. As tensions increased, the emperor began preparing his people. Messengers traveled across the empire carrying a simple but urgent call. Ethiopia must stand together. The response was unlike anything the country had seen before. Regional rulers brought their armies. Farmers left their fields. Blacksmiths forged weapons day and night. Priests gathered their congregations to pray for the nation. Women organized food, water, clothing, and medical care for the thousands of men preparing to march north. Among them stood Empress Tetubato. She urged the people not to fear. She reminded them that freedom was a treasure no nation could afford to lose. Under Menelik's leadership, old rivalries were set aside. For perhaps the first time in generations, Ethiopians from different regions stood together. Not because they shared the same language or local ruler, but because they shared the same homeland. Meanwhile, the Italian commanders remained confident. They believed their modern army would quickly defeat what they dismissed as an untrained African force. They had made a mistake that history would never let them forget. They had measured Ethiopia by its weapons. But they had failed to measure its unity. As both armies marched toward the rugged mountains of northern Ethiopia, the world watched with little expectation that an African nation could resist a European empire. No one knew it yet. But the hills around a small town called Adwa were about to become the stage for one of the most extraordinary victories in world history. Chapter 5. The day an empire was stopped. On the morning of March 1, 1896, the mountains around the town of Adwa were silent. But not for long. Before sunrise, tens of thousands of Ethiopian soldiers stood ready. Some knelt in prayer. Others embraced their brothers, sons, or friends, unsure if they would see them again. Many had marched for weeks to answer the emperor's call. They came from every corner of Ethiopia. Amhara, Oromo, Tigray, Guoroge, Afar, and many other communities. They spoke different languages. They came from different traditions. But on that day, they fought as one people. Across the valley, the Italian army prepared for battle. Its commanders believed victory was certain. They had modern rifles, heavy artillery, professional soldiers. They looked at the Ethiopian army and saw only numbers. They failed to see something far more powerful. A nation determined to remain free. Emperor Menelik II remained calm. For years, he had prepared for this moment. He had strengthened his army. He had built alliances among Ethiopia's regional rulers. He had gathered supplies, modern weapons, and experienced commanders. Now, everything depended on the decisions made that day. Beside him stood Empress Tetubato. She was not a spectator. She helped organize food and water for the troops, cared for the wounded, and encouraged the soldiers as the battle began. Her courage reminded everyone that defending Ethiopia was the responsibility of both men and women. As the first shots rang out, the mountains echoed with the sound of rifles and cannons. Smoke drifted across the hills. The battle quickly became fierce. The Italian commanders had divided their forces as they advanced through the rugged terrain. It was a costly mistake. Separated from one another, many of their units struggled to communicate or support each other. Menelik's commanders recognized the opportunity. They launched coordinated attacks from different directions, surrounding isolated Italian positions before they could regroup. Again and again, Ethiopian soldiers pushed forward. The fighting was brutal. Thousands on both sides lost their lives. But by midday, it was becoming clear that the tide had turned. The Italian lines were collapsing. Their soldiers began to retreat. Some surrendered. Others fled across the mountains, hoping to escape. By the end of the day, the impossible had happened. Ethiopia had defeated one of Europe's most powerful armies. The victory shocked the world. Soon afterward, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, formally recognizing Ethiopia as an independent and sovereign nation. For Menelik II, the battle was never about glory. It was about freedom. He understood that if Ethiopia had fallen, it would likely have become another European colony. Instead, it remained one of the few independent nations in Africa. The news of Adwa spread far beyond Ethiopia. In Africa, it inspired hope among people living under colonial rule. In the Caribbean and the Americas, people of African descent celebrated the victory as proof that Africa could resist conquest. Years later, leaders such as Marcus Garvey would point to Ethiopia as a symbol of African pride and self-determination. The Battle of Adwa became more than a military victory. It became an idea. An idea that said no empire was unbeatable. An idea that reminded the world that freedom was worth every sacrifice. For Emperor Menelik II, however, the work was far from over. Winning the battle had secured Ethiopia's independence. Now he faced an even greater challenge. building a nation strong enough to preserve that freedom for generations to come. Chapter 6. What remains? When Emperor Menelik II died on December 12, 1913, Ethiopia lost more than a ruler. It lost a leader who had changed the course of its history. For nearly 25 years, Menelik had guided Ethiopia through one of the most dangerous periods in Africa's past. While powerful European empires divided almost the entire continent among themselves, Ethiopia remained free. That freedom did not happen by chance. It was the result of years of patience, careful planning, and courageous leadership. But Menelik's legacy was about more than the Battle of Adwa. He believed that a nation could not depend on military victories forever. It had to keep growing. Under his leadership, Ethiopia began to modernize. Roads connected communities that had once been separated by mountains and valleys. The railway linking Addis Ababa to the outside world transformed trade and communication. Telegraph and telephone lines brought the country closer together. New schools opened their doors, and hospitals slowly expanded. These changes did not solve every problem. Many Ethiopians, especially those living in rural areas, continued to face poverty and hardship. His expansion of the Ethiopian empire also brought many different peoples under one government. And historians continue to debate the impact of those campaigns. For some, Menelik is remembered as the father of a united Ethiopia. For others, those same events are remembered with pain and loss. Understanding Menelik II means listening to both perspectives. History is rarely black and white. Great leaders often leave behind legacies that are both inspiring and complicated. As Menelik grew older, his health began to fail. After suffering a series of strokes, he gradually withdrew from public life. The energetic emperor who had once traveled across battlefields and negotiated with foreign diplomats could no longer govern as he once had. When he died in 1913, a remarkable chapter in Ethiopian history came to an end. But his story did not end there. Nearly 40 years later, when Italy returned to invade Ethiopia under Benito Mussolini, the memory of Adwa still inspired the Ethiopian people to resist. Across Africa, independence leaders looked to Menelik's victory as proof that colonial rule was not inevitable. His triumph gave hope to people who dreamed of governing themselves. Even today, more than a century after the Battle of Adwa, his name is remembered around the world. Not simply because he won a war, but because he proved that preparation could overcome power, that unity could defeat division, and that a determined people could protect their freedom against overwhelming odds. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of Menelik II and his life. He did not wait for history to decide Ethiopia's future. He prepared his nation to decide its own. And in doing so, he gave Africa one of its greatest victories. One that still echoes across the continent today. That is the legacy of Emperor Menelik II.